I know a good chunk of people north of the border that just cringed, reveled in disgust, and maybe even vomited upon seeing the title and the thumbnail of this video. Because today we're talking about some potential trade ideas that have been floated out there, that have been talked about on The Athletic, and that have been discussed on TSN as well regarding the Boston Bruins and one of their most impactful players on the roster. This show is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Go out there and use the first link in the description to save some money on your VPN, get some free months, and support the channel all in the process. Today we're heading over to B-Town and talking about their captain. It is none other than the Rat himself, Brad Marchand, who is already 36 years old. He is on an expiring contract, which sees him making $6.125 till the end of this season. 5'9", 176, you know him, you love him. He was a 100-point scorer a few seasons ago, and has been one of the better players in the National Hockey League, both in terms of his offensive production, his playoff impact, and just his overall antagonistic body of work. This is one of the players that is the best in the league at getting under people's skin, at making opposition pay for biting on whatever it is that he is selling, and just in terms of making the game more fun to watch. The guy is known as the Rat for a reason, and with 42 points in 54 games played this year, the Bruins captain is certainly on pace for yet another 60-point campaign, which has been roughly the benchmark he has been in for the past decade, pretty much. The guy has had 60-plus point seasons every single year, spanning back to 2014-15, so he has been one of the better players in the National Hockey League consistency-wise, and his edgy play seems to have taken a bit of a step forward as the years have gone on too. However, the Bruins kind of stink this season, and as a result, you're seeing conversations pop up all over social media as to whether or not Brad Marchand's time in Boston could be coming to an end. Now, full disclaimer, the Bruins play off against the Wild in a few minutes before this video begins, so maybe it's not really the right time to go out there and talk about this stuff, but there are some other teams that are playing north of the border that we can dive into and talk about with the context of Brad Marchand potentially going over to their teams. First, I wanted to leave a link in the description to this video segment on TSN, because you had Kevin Weeks go out there and bring this up on the broadcast. It's their own That's Hockey segment, and on the show, Kevin Weeks talks about how the Toronto Maple Leafs are a perfect fit for Brad Marchand. And essentially, Weeks goes out there and describes the tale of the tape here. Oh, Marchand has these qualities, the Maple Leafs have these questions about how dedicated they are to the game and whether or not these guys really have what it takes to lead themselves into a second or a third round, and you can definitely fill in the blanks yourself with a lot of these talking points. Brad Marchand as a leader, as somebody who's been in the room with some fantastic leaders in the past, the Charas, the Bergerons, everybody else in between. Marchand knows what it's like to be a leader and be a vocal guy. And if the Toronto Maple Leafs want to get themselves going further into the playoffs, you could debate that that's the kind of talent or a personality that they need. Somebody who can have that authoritative voice whilst providing stellar on-ice play. Not to mention the level of engagement that he brings, how committed he is to the sport, and just how he doesn't take a shift off, which is something that I think you could say about a lot of Toronto Maple Leafs over the past few years, especially in the playoffs. How many of these guys take shifts off? Brad Marchand doesn't. Haha. So, Kevin Weeks ultimately talks about it on TSN, but there were a lot of people that I saw, especially on the Maple Leafs subreddit, that were really against this idea. Like, hey, I don't want to ever think about the idea of Brad Marchand playing for the Maple Leafs. Just imagine if this guy went out there and tried some of the antics or the shenanigans that he does while wearing a Leafs jersey. Do you not think that guy would be setting himself up to get suspended and totally taken out of commission in the same way that Nazem Kadri and other guys in Maple Leafs past have been? I mean, I know a lot of people like to say the NHL has a bias against the Toronto Maple Leafs, but at the same time, it's kind of warranted because the other 50% is like, hey, the NHL and its scheduling and its television programming and everything has a bias towards the Maple Leafs. So maybe all things are equal, as they should be, as Thanos once said. But a good chunk of Maple Leafs fans I saw responded to this TV hit by Kevin Weeks saying, hey, I'd rather die than see Brad Marchand play for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Imagine that kind of treachery, even. In the whole storied lore of Toronto Maple Leafs hockey, how Brad Marchand was seen as the villain, Bergeron was seen as the villain, Chara was seen as the villain. You had so many Boston Bruins legends haunting the Toronto Maple Leafs for years and years. What more, getting another one of these guys onto your team? And quite frankly, even the face of Toronto Maple Leafs antagonism in this locker room. Of course, though, I don't really know if any Maple Leafs players themselves would care or mind, really. He's a good player, after all. It just would be hilarious for the fans and for the people that watch this sport, who pay attention to it, to dive into that overall thought process of having Marchand as a Maple Leaf. But again, it's not even just Toronto that we are diving into in this conversation. I'll also leave a link in the description to this post made on The Athletic by Alan Mitchell from earlier last week, why the Oilers and the Bruins make great trade deadline partners ahead of the 2025 deadline. And the funny part is, this is, of course, behind a paywall. We're not going to screenshot parts of this article. We're going to screenshot parts from this article instead on OilersDaily.com. Liam McCormick transcribed some of the quotes from the Athletic piece, so link is going to be in the description to this too. Alan Mitchell writes about how acquiring Brad Marchand at the deadline would be something close to a perfect fit for the Edmonton Oilers. If he does become available, Bowman and Edmonton should be aggressive in pursuing Brad Marchand. And so now we have Edmonton Oilers beat reporters going out there and writing in The Athletic that, hey, this team should go out there and get Brad Marchand. Edmonton and Marchand. In my opinion, I think about Marchand heading over to the Oil, and I just start thinking about what Corey Perry and Marchand would do together. Like, us Pacific fans were going out there already pissed off at Corey Perry and everything that he does for the Oil. Imagine if Marchand was there too. Imagine the crap that this Oilers team would get up to with a very legitimately talented point scorer in Marchand, licking people's faces and terrorizing opposition alongside of Corey Perry. These guys could be the ultimate bullies in the NHL that can take over shifts with their imposing nature, that can get under their opponent's skin, and that can make opponents play worse because they start getting into their own heads. And I mean, just thinking about Connor McDavid and Brad Marchand potentially being on even a line together, if you wanted to try that out, I mean, that's ridiculous too. Alan Mitchell goes out there and writes in The Athletic about what the price could be. It's unlikely Boston management would ever view draft picks as a worthwhile centerpiece for Marchand. If Boston requires a young NHL player, it's possible Edmonton could acquire that player from a club that's at the beginning of a rebuild process. The San Jose Sharks are an example of a team that has recently been hospitable to such a trade, and any of Savoy, O'Reilly, Aki, Berezkin, and or the draft picks might be enough to pry a substantial young player loose from another team. And so the thought process here is, hey, Boston probably is going to want a younger guy, so if Edmonton doesn't really have too many of those, maybe they could trade with San Jose or something, get a younger guy, and then flip him over to Boston for Brad Marchand. Obviously, I would think the Bruins would want a lot for Brad Marchand. I get it that he is technically a rental, but this is your captain you're talking about. This is a multi-time Stanley Cup finalist you're talking about. This is one of the best Boston Bruins maybe even ever, if we're being honest. So if a team like Toronto, a rival for the ages, and a team like Edmonton, with a Stanley Cup champion pedigree path right in front of them, comes knocking on Boston's door, I wonder what the answer is going to be. So if you're a fan of the Bruins, I want you to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. What's the situation with Brad Marchand? What are your thoughts on this guy potentially getting moved? What are your thoughts on him finding himself a new NHL home? Do you think he's just going to re-sign in Boston and this entire conversation isn't really going to mean anything? That certainly is another avenue to dive into as well. There are many different ways you can tackle this conversation after all, but I want you to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about Brad Marchand and his future in the National Hockey League. If you're a fan of the Leafs or the Oilers, what are your thoughts on Marchand heading over to your team? Do you think it's actually a meaningful fit, and would you be a fan of this? Let me know in the comments, what do you think? I hope you enjoyed this video, and bye.